The following program presents principles designed to promote good health and is not intended to take the place of personalized professional care. The opinions and ideas expressed are those of the speaker. Viewers are encouraged to draw their own conclusions about the information presented.
Hello and welcome to Health for a Lifetime. I'm your host, Don McIntosh, and today we're joined with Rob McClintock from Washington State. Welcome, Rob.
Thanks, Don.
And today we're going to be talking about a rather interesting topic, that is the mind, and more specifically, the battle for our minds. First of all, tell me, what does it mean when you say the mind? What do you mean by that?
Well, really we're talking about a very complex organ, the brain, where we find the seat of our emotions, our abstract thinking, our cognitive thinking, our practical thinking, our ability to determine what's true and what's false. And in terms of the battle, we're really looking at one thing, and that's called our allegiance. And the battle for the mind it's something that's been going on for millenniums.
So what I picture then when you're saying this is, okay, there's the practical things that our mind helps us do. There are abstract thoughts. There are all of these different things that's going on in our mind. And what you're suggesting is that there are people that are, or not maybe people, forces, whatever, that are trying to be active in those processes. What do you mean? What is this battle, and when did it begin? What's it have to do with us?
Okay, the battle for the mind, as I understand it, started in heaven. At one time in the universe, all the created and divine beings were in harmony. And Satan was not known as Satan then. He was Lucifer, and he was in harmony with Christ and with the Father. And everything was very happy and harmonious in heaven. And somehow Satan's mind began to wander in channels that it shouldn't, and he began to have doubts and began to have jealousy. And little by little, he began to plot against the divine government. And we understand from what the Scripture tells us that there was war in heaven. Well, war does not take place unless you have more than one combatant. You don't have just one. You don't have one side. You have more than one side, at least two. And we're told that from Scripture that Satan took quite a number, perhaps a third of the angels with him. And he didn't just indiscriminately go out and round up a third of the angels and force them out of heaven with him, because they would have stayed with the Father, who they were loyal to. But evidently, somehow, Satan found a way to gain control of their minds so that their allegiance then was given over to his service. And I see that not staying in heaven, but actually coming down in more practical and recent terms right here on this planet.
Okay, and why would you say that? I mean, how you're saying that on the basis of Scripture, of course, there's this war that's been described there, but what are some things that we can see that indicate that it's down here on this level?
Well, the very first beginning on this earth was when Adam and Eve were created and placed here, and they were given the opportunity to choose whether they would continue to serve God as God has intended for them, or were they going to follow Lucifer's plans and surrender the sovereignty of the Holy Spirit and the Creator over to another master. And we see Satan using a number of sophistries, beguiling agencies in order to tempt Eve's mind and deceive her. And Don, I see today so many instances where people are being deceived into surrendering the sovereignty of the seat of their heart. We talk in terms of our heart, but we're really talking about the frontal lobe of our mind, where our thought processes and our moral judgment lives. I see people surrendering that somewhat against their will.
Okay, so explain that a little bit more to me. What does that mean when you talk about the frontal lobe and surrendering the will? What happens there in the mind, and how do we surrender that?
Okay. In the brain, we have, all the different regions of the brain, and we've got, the occipital lobes, and, where some of our, more calculatory things that we do will take place. We've got our temporal lobes, and then the frontal lobe, and the very, up in our foreheads, in the very beginning, in the very top. That is where scientists tell us that our abstract thinking, where we analyze things, where we make decisions between one thing in lieu of another, we make our moral judgments, those emphasis are all placed there. The concern that I have is I see so many things that are in our environment, things that surround us, things that we see, things that we hear, and primarily a lot of the things that we eat or drink, take into our bodies, have a physical effect on the frontal lobe, many times by depleting the brain blood flow, where the blood flow is decreased, or certain chemicals now interfere with the processes, and our capacity to be loyal to God, our capacity to tell the difference between truth and fiction begin to diminish.
Give me some examples of what you're talking about.
Well, I think most people can relate to alcohol use having some effect on the brain. And I remember as a teenager, and I've still even heard in recent times, hearing, daring young bucks say, "Hey, let's head out to the bar, let's go kill some brain cells." They're quite brash about it. It doesn't seem to bother them any. They feel impervious to it. I guess when you're young, you feel immortal and invincible. But they're speaking in real terms. They are going out and they are killing brain cells. And alcohol does a number of things. Number one, it does decrease the amount of brain capacity that you have by killing some of the brain cells. Also decreasing some of the neurotransmitter solutions, changes the blood flow, and we can see impairment in people who drink alcohol. Recently the state of Washington, where I live, just changed the blood alcohol legal limit for the highways, for whether you're drinking or driving or not, based on new research that's coming out that they feel that people are intoxicated at lower limits than what they did before.
I noticed you have a graphic here for us to look at. Talk about that.
One of the things that was studied recently, so many people feel that it's drunks who cause the problems on the highways. It's drunks who cause problems socially. But, for me personally, if I drink once a week as a social drinker, I'm really causing no menace to society, and I'm really causing no menace to myself. But in the graphic, the studies that were shown indicated that people who had only had one drink per week, perhaps, still showed via scientific testing, and some of those are through PET scans, and others are where they actually measure the amount of glycogen used in the front part of the frontal lobe. The indicators were that there was still mental impairment even 24 hours after even a mild use of alcohol.
So a little wine is perhaps not so good for us.
Well, I don't think so, because if you have impairment, that means, number one, you're a menace to other people physically because of your lack of capacity to operate, an automobile or an airline. Pilot, certainly we hope he hasn't been drinking within the last 24 hours or week. But I'm not so concerned about the physical things where, as car accidents, and they're certainly bad because we know that, we're losing, quite a number of people to alcohol-related accidents. Alcohol-related accidents and illnesses combined take 100,000 people out of the United States alone in death every year. But I'm thinking more in terms in the battle of the mind is what it does to people's capacity to discern between truth and error. Because, Don, I really believe that in this last day, when Satan, we're told in the book of Peter that he's a roaring lion seeking to deceive us. He wants to take our eternal salvation from us. More now than ever in history, we need our mental capacities to be 100%.
The alcohol, I think probably some of our viewers would have a little problem with what you'd said, but most of our viewers on a Christian program would probably say, hey, you know, I'm not involved in alcohol. I don't get involved in something like that. I've heard about that. Are there other things, however, that maybe they would be involved in, things you could share with us that impact the brain, the things you're concerned about?
Well, we know that tobacco can have some negative influences as well. Anything that will decrease the amount of blood flow to that particular part of the organ will decrease our capacity to make good judgments and good decisions. Alcohol, as you know, is a vasoconstrictor. It will cause the blood vessels to narrow. They will constrict. You know, a smaller dimension in a blood vessel will mean that there's a corresponding restriction and a decrease in the flow. And we rely for our thought processes on the blood making a fresh transfer of oxygens, molecules, and also taking out some of the waste products from the brain as it goes through its processes. If that slows down, our mental capacities go down as well.
So what does it mean when someone says, hey, I just had a cigarette and I think more clearly now? They say, hey, I immediately get a rush and I seem to have more perceptive thought after I smoke. Are they not understanding what's happening, or explain that for us?
Well, to the best that I can understand it, that's actually almost an induced fantasy. Maybe it did give them a little bit more focus initially, but over the long term, they actually have less discriminatory processes than they would have had before.
Okay, so alcohol is something we're wanting to avoid in terms of our frontal lobe. Tobacco is something we're wanting to avoid. What should we do in place of those things?
Well, why do people drink? Most people drink because they're looking for an escape from something. Some people feel like they're too uptight. They need to relax. A lot of people are socially inept, at least they perceive themselves to be, and they think if they have a drink they can loosen up, they can have more fun, they can be happier people. We simply need to understand that as Christians we're God's creation, and it does not matter what people think of us. What most matters is what God thinks of us. And you know, smoking, you know, why do people smoke? Why do people drink? They're crutches when you're limping, and a Christian shouldn't be limping. A Christian can be a whole person because they're a whole new creation.
You know, and I hear what you're saying. They shouldn't be linking. Let's say I'm watching today, though, and I do smoke and I do drink, and I just can't seem to get through the day without that. What kind of counsel do you have for someone like that that's struggling? Just give us an indication. What should they put in place of that? It's, you know, it's quite easy to say, well, I don't think you should be doing that, but what do I do?
Well, that's a really good opportunity for us to share some of the better things in life. You know, if you are stressed out, a lot of people drink and smoke because of stress. A really good vigorous exercise a lot of times can be a far better stress beater than any of these sedatives could ever hope to be. If you feel like you need something to make you feel better about yourself, go for a walk in the sunshine. Eat better food. You know, a lot of people who drink and smoke don't have the greatest diet. And when you have a lot of poor dietary choices in your program, they leave a vacuum because of the good things not being there. And we begin to develop cravings and urgings for something, some outside stimulus that we wouldn't normally crave.
We're talking with Rob McClintock. When we come back, we're going to share with you how your letter grades in school can actually go up. Isn't that right, Doctor?
That's right.
And when we come back, we're going to learn some other things that you can do to enhance the functioning of your frontal lobe.
Have you found yourself wishing that you could shed a few pounds? Have you been on a diet for most of your life, but not found anything that will really keep the weight off? If you've answered yes to any of these questions, then we have a solution for you that works. Dr. Hans Deal and Dr. Eileen Luddington have written a marvelous booklet called Reversing Obesity Naturally, and we'd like to send it to you free of charge. Here's a medically sound approach successfully used by thousands who were able to eat more and lose weight permanently without feeling guilty or hungry through lifestyle medicine. Dr. Deal and Dr. Luddington have been featured on 3ABM, and in this booklet, they present a sensible approach to eating, nutrition, and lifestyle changes that can help you prevent heart disease, diabetes, and even cancer. Call or write today for your free copy of Reversing Obesity Naturally, and you could be on your way to a healthier, happier you. It's absolutely free of charge, so call or write today.
Welcome back. We've been talking with Rob McClintock, and we just were in an interesting discussion about ways you can increase your grade point average by what you do, decisions you make. Dr. McClintock, help us with that.
Okay, one of the things that we're discovering with diet that has been an interest for a long time is that there is some correlation between your diet and what your mental acuity would be. Now, we're not able to measure that in terms specifically in terms of your IQ, but we can find that what you eat and what you drink and what you listen to and see and those types of things does affect to some extent your capacity to do abstract thinking. Your attention span can be varied. There was a study with school-age children that I thought was quite interesting, where the children were given an opportunity for a period of time to have, the type of diet that kids normally would like, the sugary cereals and the candy bars and the soda pops and the desserts and on and on and on. These kids seemed to have that sort of a lifestyle because that's what their parents had been providing them. And these poor kids were, they were having a tough time in school. They were failing. They were pulling C's and D's and F's and that type of thing. And in the study, these kids were given an opportunity to where nutritionists came in and they changed their whole dietary program. And one of the major things that they took out of their diet was the sugar, the refined sugars. And they didn't provide them with special teachers. They didn't give them any special tutoring. They didn't make them stay home at night instead of going down to the arcade, and they didn't make them burn their skateboard or anything. These kids just had the one major factor where they got a decent diet with less sugar. And it was not very long. Within a course of several weeks, these kids were doing better in school. In fact, by the end of the term, they actually were pulling at least one letter grade higher than what they had come up with before.
So excessive sugar intake, just like it says there, can diminish frontal lobe function. It can mean the difference between A's and B's in school-age children. So I'm sure it could, if someone was getting a C, it would probably bring them up too, wouldn't you think?
That's right, Don. And it's not just for the kids. We always like to apply this somewhere other than our own life. But as adults, we need to understand that the sugar affects us the same way as it does the young people. And just because you and I may not be in school doesn't mean we are not needing the mental capacity that we need and we're created to have. There's a lot to why the sugar does what it does for the kids and also for us as adults. If you were to eat a large meal of carbohydrates like oatmeal and toast and some fruit and these types of things for a really good breakfast. Maybe you don't like oatmeal, but
I love oatmeal.
Okay, some sort of a cereal. Yeah. Some people hit me when I say oatmeal, but I like it. But that genre of food, you are taking a fair amount of fiber and a lot of other material with it. It takes the body a while to digest those items. And during that time, you're having a sustained release of the sugar that's being released into the system. And the body then has an opportunity to have a sustained release of matching insulin. And all of this, in turn, provides the body or the brain with the proper amount of glycogen, which is brain fuel. And the brain only has at any given time, 2 minutes or maybe a little less of this brain fuel on reserve. What happens is when a kid eats a candy bar, drinks a soda pop, or an adult, either one, you have a rush of sugar, and the body says, wait a minute, there must be a lot of food that's going to enter my system right now. I'll have to put out a lot of insulin now. And so it begins to burn up all of that extra sugar. And now we end up with blood sugar lows, and we begin to come down, and there's less capacity to have the right amount of fuel for the brain to function right. And so our brain has to slow down to match the fuel.
So it's really not so much the sugar, it's how it's released. It's the difference between a high-octane fuel and a diesel, I guess, or
Correct.
something that unpacks itself slowly versus fast.
That's correct.
So what I hear you saying is that every food, in a sense, is a brain food.
Can be. It just depends how we balance them as we put them into our dietary program.
In other words, what I mean, it can be negative or positive.
Right.
Everything affects it somehow.
It's either going to add or take away, and that's one of the things that we need to look at. The things on my plate, is this going to enhance my capacity to think and tell the difference between God's words and Satan's words, or are these things going to actually detract from what I'm doing?
So the sugar, you've said, is not so much bad, it's just how it's delivered, and you're saying the best way to deliver that is through carbohydrates or those things that unpack themselves slowly.
That's correct.
What about fats? Is there anything good about fats? Is there anything bad about fats in terms of how it affects the brain?
Well, fats and sugars can do the same things in some respects. One of the things that the sugar does, in addition to causing the lows when we eat too much in the wrong form, it actually acts to congeal or gel, the serum of the blood. So now we're having to move blood through those fine blood vessels in the frontal lobe. Now that the syrupy, thickened, jelly-type blood is trying to be forced through, again, it cannot go through as fast as it would like to, and our oxygen transport and our fuel transport to our brain slows our brain down, slows our judgment down. Fat can act in the same way. The fat can actually begin to stick our blood cells together. Our red blood cells begin to clump up, and you know that if 100 of us held hands and tried to walk through a door, somebody's going to have to let go sooner or later. And that's one of the things that we see inside of the brain, that these cells are having to actually be forced apart to flow through the brain. And again, you've slowed down the opportunity.
So I have my big sugar rush in the morning I'm on the way to work, and I stop by the fast food restaurant of my choice, and I get my big, sugar rush. And I also have a nice big, Egg McMuffin or something, not to bring any particular person into this, but I have this big fatty meal along with the sugar, and then I decide, well, what I'll do is I'll just have maybe a Pepsi or a Coke or something to go along with it to pick me up because I'm feeling kind of sluggish. Is that a good idea?
Well, probably not a real great idea, because as you hinted and alluded to, those first two things are actually going to cause you to be suffering from oxygen deprivation. When I used to fly airplanes, they used to tell us not to spend too many minutes above a certain elevation, because once you would go past your limit, you would begin to feel very happy. You'd be tired, things would be just moving great. And so a lot of people feel that way. They say they feel better when they eat these types of foods because of the oxygen deprivation. But adding caffeine is not necessarily going to do the greatest thing for you. Caffeine has substances in it that will interfere with your neurotransmitters. Now, in neurotransmitters, each nerve cell is going to have to be releasing a certain amount of certain neurotransmitter solutions, handing it over to the next one, to the next one, to the next one, and that's how the impulses from one nerve cell to the other are transmitted. Caffeine releases certain substances that upset the balance. We have one neurotransmitter, acetylcholine, which is acetylcholine is kind of like the gas pedal, and adenosine sort of like the brake. And together, they move things through traffic in the right sequence and at the right speed. And when you begin to add these substances from the caffeine to try and pick you up and make you feel better, you're doing some wild things to your body. If you took 1 cup of coffee and took the caffeine out of it, about 120, 125 milligrams, put it into a needle or into a hypodermic and shot it in your arm, you'd be dead in minutes because it's that toxic. But putting it through your stomach and your digestive tract, you release it a little bit slower, and the body says, wait a minute, here's a poison, I've got to burn it off. And so, up with the metabolism and releasing tons of adrenaline. In terms of the body, that's not a great thing, but in terms of the mind, what bothers me is you'll see somebody who's really, really angry, they've got tons of adrenaline, or they're very, very afraid, tons of adrenaline. People who are very angry and people who are very afraid do not think rationally, and they do some pretty wild things. And increasing the amount of adrenaline to try and burn off the toxicity of this caffeine is not going to cause us to have clarity of thought.
So much for my good idea.
Okay.
It wouldn't really be a happy meal then, would it?
No.
If you added all that together. Well, we have just a few minutes left here. We've talked about some things that can be damaging. We've talked about alcohol, we've talked about tobacco, we've talked about caffeine, we've talked about fat and the effect that it can have on our frontal lobes and how it can really cause some problems. In the rest of our time together, and just the few moments we have, what are some real positive things our viewers can do? What can they do to really feed that frontal lobe what it needs?
Well, to do a real positive thing for your brain and for your mind, we need to cover all of our bases. We need to be putting in natural foods, not chemically derived foods, but good natural foods. Produce, fruits, vegetables, grains, nuts, the complex carbohydrates rather than the refined carbohydrates, so you have a sustained release of the sugar, one that the body can keep up with. Anybody now today knows that fat is probably not that good for you, but they're thinking in terms of their arteries for their heart. We're thinking in terms of our mind. Lots of exercise to get that blood moving so that you have, the oxygen there that you need to think. Sufficient water so that you can bathe your mind, so that your brain cells are pure and are clean, so that they can make the proper, synapse transfers of information.
So what you're saying is a lot like what our mother said, which is, hey, drink your water, have a healthy, balanced meal, avoid those things that are not so good for you, the things you've mentioned, caffeine, alcohol, smoking, and really have a more balanced approach eating foods as grown. Well, thank you very much, Dr. McClintock, for being with us. I know that as a result of being together today, we're going to have better grades, we're going to feel better, and we will have health